everybody. It is Thursday, August 8th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, neither of us own cats, but I understand that today, August 8th, is International Cat Day. So a happy cat day to all the cat owners in the Mo.news community today.
Including Taylor Swift, who is part of the news today.
Yes, we'll get to that story in a second. I don't know what the cat ladies have up to. I know, with the J.D. Vance remarks last week, there's a lot of people who are on the defensive. That's become a whole meme as he attacked cat owners. Anyway, to the felines out there, maybe there's a discount out there for cat food or something related to your pet. Go check it out.
All right, and also a happy Friday Eve to everybody. Let's get to the headlines here, starting with presidential politics. Dueling campaign events in Wisconsin and Michigan as both Republicans and Democrats sharpened their attacks against each other.
And we'll tell you why J.D. Vance walked over to Kamala Harris's plane yesterday, Air Force Two, on the tarmac, what he had to say.
Meanwhile, an ISIS threat at a Taylor Swift concert foiled in Austria, but authorities are canceling the shows anyway, what we know.
Jill, it's going to be the Swifties versus ISIS.
My money's on the Swifties.
My money is always on the Swifties.
Also overseas, Ukraine launching an attack into Russia. What could be their strategy? And back here in the U.S., tropical storm Debby drenching the East Coast with inches of rain. Where the storm is headed next?
Jill, we've been hearing from people stuck on the tarmac at various airports around the country trying to find routes around Debby.
And will the frozen housing market finally unthaw? Some numbers show that things might be at least starting to turn around. And remember those Starliner astronauts who were supposed to spend 8 days in space? Well, they're still up there. And now NASA says they may not come home until next year.
But folks, don't worry. They have food. They have oxygen. We'll explain.
But do they have enough underwear? That's my question.
They're doing a lot of laundry. Way more laundry than they thought they were going to be.
And we will have an Olympics update, including the oldest skateboarder to compete. Plus, Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill, the clue today is, here's to you, Mrs. Robinson.
What could it be?
It could be a music group. It could be a movie. It could be an actor. Something related there.
Fair enough.
All
right, let the campaign season officially begin. The full tickets are set. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance versus Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. And the dueling campaign rallies are happening. On Wednesday, Vice President Kamala Harris and her newly minted running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, held a rally in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. It was packed with people lined up as far as the eye could see just to get in. So 2 days into this new ticket, the enthusiasm is still quite high. Walz wasting no time attacking Donald Trump.
He mocks our laws. He sows chaos and division amongst the people. And that's to say nothing of the job he did as president. He froze in the face of COVID, and it cost people's lives. He drove the economy into the ground. And make no mistake about it, violent crime was up when Donald Trump was president.
Harris and Walz made it to all of the blue wall states, as they're called, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, in the 36 hours after the announcement of their complete ticket. They're calling it the Blue Walls. Get it?
Yeah.
A campaign official says they've raised $36 million in just the 24 hours since Harris announced Walz as her running mate. Not to be outdone, Republican J.D. Vance also campaigning in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and he had a campaign stop in Michigan early on Wednesday. He even tried to approach Kamala Harris on a tarmac in Wisconsin to, quote, check out his future plane, a little tongue in cheek there. And he did stop to talk to the press who follows the vice president, questioning why she hasn't really answered any media questions.
Why does she refuse to answer questions from the media? And I also thought that the press gaggle following her might get a little lonely. I at least have enough respect for you all and for the American people you report to come and talk to you and to answer some questions.
And Moshe, it is a fair point, as we've talked about on the podcast. The vice president's job in many ways is to support the president and his or her positions. And of course, this has been an unprecedented campaign season with President Biden dropping out after the primaries. So do you expect that Harris will at some point lay out her positions on the issues?
She's going to have to. J.D. Vance yesterday noting it's been 17 days. July 21st was the day that Biden dropped out. So more than 2 weeks now that she hasn't sat down for a formal interview. Now, keep in mind, we talked about this on the pod. There's a whole process you typically engage in during normal campaign years. You spend time, you have teams together. You're like, okay, healthcare team, like let's dive into what I should do on this. Energy team, what should I do on climate change? A foreign policy team, what are my views on China, on Taiwan, on Ukraine, on et cetera, et cetera. Now, obviously, she has a vantage point because she's been vice president, but where is she going to zag? Where is she going to differ from Biden here? She has not laid that out. I certainly expect that to come soon. In fact, as we record this, Jill, they might be announcing a 60 Minutes interview. She's going to do a 60 Minutes sit-down probably at some point. She might do like a formal sit-down with some of the other networks. She's going to have to do that. She's going to have to do some print publications, the New York Times, the Washington Post, some of those typical publications. Now, keep in mind, the Republicans have been mainly sticking to friendly media, the Fox News, et cetera. So maybe they launch her with a, more liberal reporter or liberal outlet that'll offer a more friendly interview, a Rachel Maddow, perhaps. So we will see what happens there. But certainly this scrutiny will get louder. J.D. Vance has a strategy here, which is, hey, media, why aren't you asking these questions? Why aren't you pushing her harder? She hasn't spoken to you. She took one question on the tarmac when the prisoners came home, when Gershkovich came home. So she's basically spoken for about 35 seconds in 2.5 weeks in an impromptu way. So this certainly... Wait for the volume to get louder here on Harris. What does she stand for? What are her issue positions? Again, is she just, copy paste Biden, or is she going to differ here in some ways? So they're making their way across the Midwest. These are all key states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, probably just like 2016, just like 2020, are going to dictate who the winner is this year. States that are very 50-50 right now. One of the other attack lines the Republicans are trying out is they try to, basically characterize Tim Walz, who's not known to 70% of America, according to the latest polls. Who is he? So Vance, one of the issues he brought up yesterday was Walz's military service, which is Democrats have been playing up, more than 2 decades in the National Guard. Well, Vance he was a Marine, right? He fought in Iraq in the war in 2004. It turns out that Walz, who had spent more than 2 decades in the National Guard, went and left the National Guard and ran for Congress in 2005 when he would have ended up being sent over there. Take a listen here to J.D. Vance.
When the United States Marine Corps, when the United States of America asked me to go to Iraq to serve my country, I did it. I did what they asked me to do it, and I did it honorably, and I'm very proud of that service. When Tim Walz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him, a fact that he's been criticized for aggressively by a lot of the people that he served with. I think it's shameful.
So just to wrap that up, Walz ran for Congress from Minnesota in 2005. That was about the time he was going to be deployed. The Harris-Walz campaign responds, quote, after 24 years of military service, Governor Walz retired in 2005 and ran for Congress, where he chaired the Veterans Affairs Committee. He was a tireless advocate for men and women in uniform. As vice president, he will do the same. He's faced these attacks in the past when he was running for re-election in Minnesota in 2022. His Republican opponent questioned the decision, again, the timing in 2005 of leaving the service just before he was about to be deployed. Walz at the time responded with a letter from more than 50 veterans praising his record, his leadership, his time in the National Guard. He was an opponent of the war in Iraq. Notably, at this juncture, both Democrats and Republicans, one of the things they agree on was that the war in Iraq was a mistake. Still, they're trying to poke holes in his service. It's something you saw Bush do to Kerry 20 years ago, John Kerry having been a veteran, George W. Bush having avoided Vietnam, but Republicans going on the offensive there to question Kerry's time in Vietnam. And you see this happening here. Despite the complication here, Trump is accused of also avoiding a war. This happens to be Vietnam. He's much older, by getting a doctor's diagnosis that he had bone spurs. That was a common thing you could do if you had a certain amount of money and clout during that Vietnam era. Suddenly you had bone spurs, so you wouldn't be drafted into the war in Vietnam. So one of the attack lines here is they try to frame Tim Walz. At the same time, you have Harris and Walz trying to frame themselves. You also have policies being rolled out here. Donald Trump has been down in Mar-a-Lago. He's done some interviews, though he hasn't been on the campaign trail for a few days now. He does plan to go back out on Friday. He happened to call into Fox News yesterday morning. He says he's thrilled with the Walz pick. He's like, this is our dream. They were very fearful, as we've told you, about Josh Shapiro and the impact he or Mark Kelly could have had as a moderate, helping Democrats lock in Arizona or Pennsylvania. As far as policy, among the things Trump is talking about right now is floating the idea of more tax cuts. He is calling for the end of taxing Social Security benefits, which would give a boost to retirees. Of course, retirees is a very large group here in America, as all the boomers have retired. The plan would cost the federal government, though, nearly $2 trillion in revenue at a time we're already running huge deficits. We have a huge debt. So that is very unlikely to pass because it's the opposite we need to do. We need to find ways for the government to bring in more money to cut the debt. But Trump is calling for a bunch of tax cuts here. Remember, in the last 90 days of the campaign, there's going to be a lot of things called for historically that never get passed, but people will hear about it and be like, oh, I should totally vote for that person if they're going to do that. It's likely not happening, folks. Reality check. Trump has also floated a tax cut for hotel and restaurant workers in Nevada, people who earn tips. That likely is also not going to happen. Again, campaign promises, politicians throwing out promises in campaign season. Does that feel new to you?
It goes back to high school days when you'd be running for class president and you're like, free ice cream on Fridays,
Jill,
2 proms.
This triggers me. I ran for 6th grade class president and I lost. Why? Because I was an honest broker. And the person who ran against me said that they would get more stuff in the vending machines, more snacks. And I was like, you can't do that. Well, my fellow 12-year-olds decided they would go with the person who was promising better snacks in the snack machines and more snacks. Anyway, bottom line, I lost. It disenchanted me. I doubled down. I'm here today as a journalist, as a podcaster, because my attempt at politics in 6th grade failed me. And I was like, I need to go to a place where I can call balls and strikes and be honest with the people.
So it all started with the 6th grade student council run. I appreciate it.
Yeah, listen, It just, that triggered me. And by the way, Trump's not alone here. There's a bunch of stuff the Democrats are promising. We told you about Biden's promise about Supreme Court reforms, all the various things that he's promising right now, and Harris is likely taking up. A lot of those things are not going to happen either. And so we'll try as they roll this stuff out to give you a reality check on all of them.
So Trump has been very active on his social media platform, Truth Social, in one post writing that perhaps President Biden will crash the Democratic National Convention, where he's, by the way, slated to speak on the first night.
The first night, August 19th, is like the tribute to Biden night. Yeah.
But he's going to crash and be like, guys, new speech. I want back in. Anyway, Trump wrote that Biden might try to take back the nomination from Kamala Harris. I don't know a lot, Moshe, but I don't think that's happening.
Well, first of all, the last 6 weeks have been unpredictable, Jill, and I appreciate Donald Trump's creativity here as he sits in Mar-a-Lago and like puts out these posts where he's like, you know what would be cool? Biden should take back the nomination. It speaks to a couple things. One, Trump is desperate to run against Biden again. He was doing amazing against Biden. He was going to crush Biden in the fall. So he's like, are you sure, Joe? You don't want to run against me anymore? Now, Joe Biden, I'm sure, is still annoyed. There was an interesting interview this week with Nancy Pelosi where MSNBC asked her, like, hey, have you talked to Joe since the whole him dropping out? And she goes, no. She goes, are you guys still close? And she goes, you'll have to ask President Biden. I respect him greatly. Nancy Pelosi having run the secret campaign to push Biden out. So there's definitely still splits in the party. Clearly, Biden would prefer to be running again. He's not. But Trump is sitting here, and there's some critique here from Republicans who are like, you should be just fighting Kamala Harris. She is your opponent. Why are you engaging in fantasy about running against Biden again? You can frame her as a liberal, as untested. The world's a crazy place. The economy is, unsure right now with the stock market. And he's putting out these posts about like Joe Biden should totally crash the convention and take back the nomination. It would be cool to cover, but it's probably not happening.
It also is a little bonkers, which some people have said that this is worth covering just because it's so out there that this is what that it is newsworthy in and of itself, that this is what the
Republican presidential nominee is talking about. Yeah.
And former president is talking about. Yes.
Listen, it's going to be a very interesting final 90 days here, folks.
And Moshe, a story that we did talk about over on the Instagram account, according to financial disclosures and confirmed by a spokesperson for Tim Walz, he does not own a single stock, nor does his wife. The disclosures show that he has no mutual funds, bonds, private equities, or other securities. He doesn't even own real estate. The couple, apparently, according to Axios, sold their home in Minnesota after moving into the governor's mansion for below asking price. We have talked about
this. In this market?
We've talked about the issue and problems with lawmakers owning stock and efforts to ban stock trading for members of Congress. In fact, Walz, as a Congress member, was pushing that, was one of the Congress members who was pushing that. But some have questioned if perhaps Walz is up to running the biggest economy in the world.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the scenario there is that like somehow if he has to replace Kamala Harris, how would he handle the duties as president? It's something we've talked about a lot on this podcast is the electoral benefits of the VP, which, go through November. But then ultimately, if you're actually VP, you have a couple duties. One, your only constitutional duty is to be alive. John Adams described it as such as the worst job in history. He was the first vice president. He's like, I have the most inconsequential job in the world. My job is to be alive in case George Washington dies. And that's been the rule of thumb. Vice presidents otherwise, in many cases, had nothing to do, which is why they gave them president of the Senate as an official duty. Some vice presidents have been busier than others. Dick Cheney, probably the most prominent example in the past 100 years, because W gave Dick Cheney like, hey, foreign policy, what are we going to do? And obviously, you had 9/11 in Iraq. And Cheney, actually, if he had his druthers, would have also invaded Syria and Iran, based on what we know now. Bottom line is, with that background, if for some reason something was to happen to Harris, can Tim Walz run the world, right? Deal with Iran, Russia, China, the economy, etc. So certainly something people will look into. It's less of an issue because she happens to be 60. We no longer have an 81-year-old Democratic presidential nominee. It's one of the things that people are scrutinizing about J.D. Vance, given that Trump, if he was to win, would be a year older than Biden as he takes over, would be a year older than Biden was when he started this current term. So both VPs being scrutinized there. I think the average voter probably not thinking about this stuff. By the way, I should note, Jill, I looked this up as we were talking here. They sold the home in 2019, so before the COVID price surge. So I think we can excuse Walz on below market for his home. Also, he probably was elected governor and had to sell it pretty quick. That said, interesting contrast here with Vance, who is a venture capitalist, multimillionaire, owns several homes now, has a range of assets. He owns gold, he owns crypto, a variety of items according to his financial disclosure forms. And so that's what we know. An interesting contrast between Walz and Vance there.
Okay, now to a terrorism threat against Taylor Swift shows in Europe. 3 Taylor Swift concerts that were scheduled in Vienna, Austria this week have been canceled after 2 suspects were arrested for allegedly plotting a terror attack. The 2 men were arrested yesterday after Austrian authorities became aware of them starting to prepare for that potential attack at the concert. The 19-year-old main suspect is believed to have ties to a terrorist group, ISIS, while the second suspect was allegedly radicalized online. Authorities seized chemical substances during a related house search on Wednesday. This is according to an Austrian newspaper. The substances are reportedly being evaluated. Swift's Eras Tour was set to play 3 shows this week in Vienna starting on Thursday. One of the event organizers, Barracuda Music, writing on Instagram that they have no choice but to cancel the shows to ensure the safety of everyone involved. Initially, Moshe, even after word of this terror plot was exposed, the show was supposed to still go on.
Yeah, and then they realized, like, we just need to cancel these shows, especially since an estimated 170,000 people, fans, were expected at the concerts in Austria. They were all totally sold out, Jill, as I am sure some of the people who listen to this podcast have seen. There's also been a number of Americans who've been traveling to the European shows because it's been cheaper to literally buy a ticket to Europe, stay in a hotel, see a Taylor Swift show, and come back than the ticket prices that we saw here in the U.S. The 19-year-old main suspect was arrested just south of Vienna, the second person in Vienna proper. After Vienna, Swift has 6 concerts scheduled for Wembley Stadium starting August 15th. And then the international tour continues. The tour ends in Canada in December. And I think they're being very cautious here, given the events of recent years. You might remember back in 2017, the Ariana Grande show in Manchester, England. 22 people were killed when a suicide bomber set up a backpack bomb in Manchester Arena. That was at the end of Grande's concert as all these fans were leaving. More than 100 people were injured, beyond the nearly 24 killed there. There was an official inquiry that was done in Britain by their domestic intelligence agency, MI5, and they found in that inquiry that they didn't act swiftly enough on key information. They missed opportunities to prevent the bombing, and that was the deadliest extremist attack in the UK in a number of years. So I think the authorities in Austria, I imagine now the authorities in the UK, are going to be very cautious about security, just given how large these shows are.
Time for the speed read from ABC News. A major move by Ukraine this week. Its army has launched a major attack with its troops into Russia, and it appears to be the biggest and most serious incursion into Russia by Ukrainian troops in this 2.5-year war so far. A Ukrainian force numbering in the hundreds, backed with armored vehicles, advanced on Tuesday across the border into Russia's Kursk region. The Ukrainian troops appeared to have captured a number of settlements in the border area, advancing perhaps as much as 10 miles inside of Russia. The Ukrainian incursion prompted Russian President Vladimir Putin to hold urgent meetings on Wednesday with his government and defense leadership, while local authorities said thousands of Russian civilians were being evacuated away from the fighting. Russia's defense ministry initially claimed to have rebuffed the Ukrainian attack and forced them to retreat, but it was clear on Wednesday that intense fighting was still going on as Russian officials announced even more evacuations of civilians from the region. So although the picture is still not exactly clear, what is clear is that this Ukrainian attack was the largest mounted yet into Russia.
Yeah, so just to reset here, the reason why this is so surprising is because it was Russia that invaded Ukraine in 2022. It's Russia that controls about 20%, occupies 20% of Ukraine right now. Ukraine's been on the defensive in its own country trying to recapture territory. So they're trying a new tactic here, going into Russia. And there's a number of theories here because the Ukrainians are not really commenting on why they did this, why they sent units across the border into Russia as opposed to just focusing on the defense of their own country. So one theory is that it's going to force Russia to divert its forces out of Ukraine. So basically, now that Ukraine's on the offensive inside Russia, Russia's like, oh, we got to pull some troops out. Well, they got to pull the troops out from where? From Ukraine, which then potentially enables Ukraine to take back more of its territory. So sort of an end-around play in terms of what they're doing there. Separately, this could also be an attempt to preempt a planned Russian offensive. The Russians have been trying to invade different parts of Ukraine in recent months to set up new battlefronts beyond the 600-mile battlefront that's currently in the east. That's been the case for about 2.5 years. And so the idea is to stop them from another incursion. Russia's been doing its thing because they're trying to exhaust, to deplete Ukrainian forces here. The third theory is that Ukraine's actually trying to take a piece of Russia because if you want to negotiate for an end to the war and you want some of your territory back, taking some of Putin's territory might give you some leverage. So that's another theory here. So we'll look out for statements from Zelensky and Ukrainian authorities. Again, they're not really talking right now and acknowledging all of this, but it is certainly risky. Ukraine is suffering from a lot of troop shortages right now. Jill, when you and I were at NATO in recent weeks, in Washington, one of the things the officials told us there is that you have a lot of Ukrainian soldiers, some of them amputees, returning to the battlefield because Ukraine is so short on resources right now. So does invading Russia right now and taking a piece of Russia make sense? Tactically, I'd be surprised if Ukraine did this without talking to the Pentagon and UK authorities first, but it's going to be something we're watching.
From USA Today, as tropical storm Debby strengthened along the Atlantic coast Wednesday, millions in the Carolinas braced for the system to make a second landfall, further inundating rain-soaked communities and extending widespread flooding through the mid-Atlantic region. Forecasters say Debby could be the wettest landfalling hurricane ever. It has drenched parts of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina in over a foot of rain. The flash floods forced evacuations, overwhelmed drainage systems, and breached multiple dams in Georgia. At least 5 deaths have been tied to this storm. North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper says that they've activated 17 swiftwater rescue teams, and they're staging them all along the coast and deploying more than 350 members of the National Guard.
Yeah, we've been hearing from a number of you affected in the region, a number of you who've had flights trying to get around this storm on the East Coast. It's going to be a very messy couple days. Debby could dump another up to 9 inches of rain in areas of the Carolinas. Local amounts could range up to 2 feet of rain in South Carolina, just over 1 foot of rain in North Carolina. One meteorologist warning people should be prepared to seek higher ground and know of an evacuation route and have one in place if you don't already. Some mid-Atlantic cities already beginning to feel Debby's effects. New York City, Philadelphia, Newark, getting messy, again, leading to a lot of travel delays, etc. And this is expected through the weekend. Potential urban flooding here. As we've seen in recent years, a lot of these storms pack a really big punch when it comes to rain, can drop a lot of inches in a short amount of time, overwhelming certain areas. So stay close to your weather apps, folks.
From MarketWatch, applications for mortgages rose as home buyers and homeowners raced to seize on a drop in mortgage rates. The 30-year rate fell to 6.55%. That's the lowest level since May of last year, after the Federal Reserve indicated that an interest rate cut was on the table. A separate report from Fannie Mae this week showed that refinance applications rose by 21% from the previous week, and activity jumped to the highest level since September of 2022. The housing market, as we've been reporting, has pretty much been frozen recently. With higher mortgage rates and inflated home prices, there's been little incentive for homeowners to put their houses on the market and lose their lower mortgage rates.
This also gives some people who bought homes in the last year, when rates were higher than this, the opportunity to refinance. The 30-year average topped out at nearly 8% last October, before now slightly coming down. And the possibility of this rate cut, which could happen in a matter of weeks here, could help bring that 30-year even lower. Refinancing applications rose to the highest level in 2 years this week. But purchase activity edging up about 1%. The issue, as we've told you, as many of you are aware, if you're looking for a home, just not that much inventory, not that much building. So prices have gone up even with the rates coming down here. So the thinking is some people could come off the sidelines here as rates start to get into the 6s after being in the 7s and nearly the 8s for some folks. And so we'll watch the housing market here. But again, the bottom line is there ain't, depending on what categories you're purchasing in, there might still not be a lot of inventory.
From Reuters, the 2 astronauts that we've been telling you are stuck in space for the last 2 months. Well, it might be a while before they get to come back to Earth. NASA said on Wednesday that astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams, who made their way up to the International Space Station in June using Boeing's Starliner, might not be able to return until next February. So we're talking 2025, Moshe.
They had plans, Jill. It's like Gilligan's Island. It's supposed to be an 8-day trip. It might be an 8-month trip. An 8-hour tour, 8-day tour. Yeah.
Weddings, bar mitzvahs, babies.
Hey!
Hope nothing was planned.
Right, I was going to say a lot of family members might have to reschedule some stuff because they were going to be back for the 4th of July, and now they're going to be spending New Year's and potentially Valentine's Day in space.
So there is a scenario that they'll have to come back on a different craft. The SpaceX's Crew Dragon, if their Boeing Starliner is still deemed unsafe to return to Earth, which would be a huge blow for Boeing. The Starliner spacecraft launched in June, carrying those 2 astronauts to the ISS in a test mission required before NASA can certify the spacecraft for routine astronaut flights.
This is a big deal, the Boeing Starliner. It was years delayed, over budget. They finally got it off the ground in June. We heard from some people who worked on the project being like, finally, we're ready to go. And the deal with NASA is we're going to do a bunch of trips. Well, the first trip gets up there and they're dealing with helium leaks, other issues. And now there's a scenario, Jill, if they have to return via Elon Musk's SpaceX craft, that the Boeing Starliner comes back to Earth with no people in it, which doesn't portend well for Boeing and the deal they have right now. But again, they're supposed to go for 8 days. It might be 8 months here. There's been an array of issues with the propulsion system, et cetera. And they tried to reschedule like, hey, it's going to be another week. It's going to be another 2 weeks. It's going to be another 3 weeks. Now it could be a couple months. Now it could be next year.
NASA has said, and Boeing has said, that they perhaps made a mistake saying it was going to be 8 days because maybe they set expectations a little too high.
Right. Like there was a scenario they could have gone up there and be like, hey, they're going to enjoy their time in space and we'll let you know when they come back. Well, Boeing hasn't been very good at PR and communications for a while here, in addition to some of the other issues we've seen. And so that has obviously been with their 737 MAXs, and this has to do with their Starliner. So there's a lot of scenarios here. SpaceX, the Dragon, which has had much more success and has been used for a couple years here, as NASA's been waiting for Boeing, has a trip that was actually planned for this month that's been pushed back to September. They were going to send up 4 astronauts. Now they might send up 2 to have 2 extra seats available. So we could bring home Wilmore and Williams before February. It could happen this fall. They have to figure out the logistics of space transport. Now, for those of you who are worried, they're on the International Space Station. The space station right now, there's 7 other astronauts there on a different mission, plus Wilmore and Williams. That's 9. I'm told that they can take the space station. They can take it up to 13 people. There's oxygen. There's food. We can send up rockets with extra supplies. No issue. So it's not like, some sort of Hollywood movie here, like, oh my God, we're running out of time. They're good. There's also an emergency craft. They're good up there. It's a little tight. As you noted earlier, they're probably doing more laundry than expected. They've taken into service by the space station being like, hey, while you guys are around, can you help us with some projects here and some spacewalks and various experiments? We're doing it in space. So they're doing that. But just think about it. Just think about this. You thought you were going up to space for 8 days. You had some plans in July. And now you're like, guys, I might see you next March. I'm stuck up here.
It's one thing for it to be extended by a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
It's now going to almost be a year.
Yeah. I imagine they have a lot to say. They'll probably be more honest about it after this trip is over, as opposed to from space. By the way, we should note Boeing and NASA don't like using the term stuck, even though we're using the term stuck. They're not stuck up there. They have oxygen, they have food, they have supplies. It's just taking a bit longer to ensure the safety of the Boeing Starliner is up to snuff, and so we can put them back on it and fly back to Earth. But the last thing Boeing wants is to, God forbid, worst case scenario, that the craft that there's some sort of accident, right? So that's why I think they're trying to be super, super cautious about this. Anyway, we're thinking about you right now, Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams. We hope you're keeping busy up there. You're into Sudoku or something.
Given what's going on here on Earth, good for them.
maybe it's who knows how this election's going to go. Maybe it's much better to be up there than down here.
Some Olympics news from The Athletic. Cole Hocker, an American distance runner, not favored in this week's 1,500-meter final, surged past Norway and Great Britain's runners on the final turn to win gold. And then there's skateboarding. If you paid attention to skateboarding in its Tony Hawk heyday, you may have heard of Andy McDonald. Well, he's still around. He's still going strong. And at 51 years old, he's the oldest skateboarder to compete in the Olympics. He's actually competing for Great Britain. McDonald ultimately did not make it to the final. He finished 18 out of 22, but he does not care. He said, I could have fallen on every run and just be as happy as I am now. It doesn't matter. This has been the experience of a lifetime. The first few days I was here, I was getting like 4 hours of sleep because I was up in the Olympic Village. I bought an electric skateboard. So I was just zooming around, meeting everybody.
Fun fact for you, because we're getting to the portion of the podcast where we age ourselves. Tony Hawk is now so old, his son Riley Hawk just married Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love's daughter. So just FYI, the kids...
Oh my God, that hurts my head.
Just the offspring of Nirvana and the offspring of Tony Hawk, they're now old enough to be married. So anyway, dinner table conversation for you later today. Meanwhile, while we stick with the Olympics here, the U.S. women's national team went on to the final after a heart-stopping 1-0 win in extra time against Germany. Sophia Smith scored in the 95th minute there. They're going to play against Brazil for the gold medal on Saturday morning. And the men's basketball, we're watching Team USA make its way through various countries. They breezed past Brazil by more than 30 points in the last day. Their next semifinal matchup is against Serbia. That's 3 p.m. Eastern today, if you're looking to watch that. And then a gold medal game against France or Germany. The good news, after we told you recently about their slow start against South Sudan, the Americans, LeBron and company, have been crushing it. They keep playing their very good games. And so, that's sort of the expectation these days at the Olympics. that there's a few guarantees in life, death, taxes, and the dream team winning in basketball. All right, on this day, August 8th, 8-8, we begin in the year 1588. The Spanish Armada was defeated. It was an enormous 130-ship naval fleet that was dispatched by Spain as part of an invasion plan against England to make England Catholic again after Henry VIII left the church. It would have dictated the future of the New World. I mean, think about all the explorers. What part of the Americas speak Spanish versus English? Well, the English would defeat the Armada. Queen Elizabeth I would secure Protestant rule, the future of the English crown, and there you have it. There's a Billy Madison reference in there. I don't know if anyone obsessively watched that film as a kid as I did, but Spanish Armada. Yeah. Tell your husband, be like, Spanish Armada, and see if he knows the reference. All right. On this day in 1846, what's called the Wilmot Proviso was a congressional amendment to prohibit the extension of slavery across new territories in the U.S., like Texas. It was proposed. It failed. But notably out of that, the Republican Party launches that as part of its platform, this new party, the Republican Party, wants to stop the expansion of slavery. And so they would start to gather strength, and then they would run their first presidential candidate, who would win, a guy by the name of Abraham Lincoln, a decade later. All right, sticking with presidential news here, we go a century ahead, 1974 on this day, faced with near certain impeachment. That's back when presidents were scared of impeachment. The Watergate scandal is at its peak. President Nixon announces his resignation on this day. Here's a bit of that speech.
Would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The following day, the famous scene of Nixon walking off onto the presidential helicopter, giving the salute with his two arms, Gerald Ford succeeding him. And we end here with some music history. On this day in 1969, the cover for the Beatles album Abbey Road was photographed, that famous photo that many people like to, I'm sure has been replicated at this point tens of millions of times, the Abbey Road cover album photo. On this day in 1988, NWA releases their debut album, Straight Outta Compton, featuring a very young Dr. Dre. And in sort of viral, meme-ish music news, on this day in 2005, Nickelback released their song, Look at This Photograph. You remember that one?
Of course I do.
We won't put it in your head, though. Sorry, Nickelback. And your clue today, Mrs. Robinson, Dustin Hoffman turns 87 today, Jill.
Wow.
Happy birthday, Dustin. He's almost old enough to run for president.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us, subscribe. This way you don't miss an episode. And throw us a review in the App Store. We would really appreciate it.
Yeah, 5 stars. You know how to do it if you haven't done it already.
Bye, everyone.